Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Alex, and this is my channel Frank Fiction, where I talk about pretty much anything I want related to books and the book publishing industry. I'm coming at you today with another monthly wrap-up video, and I recognize that doing a wrap-up video for April in the middle of May shows that I'm very far behind right now on my video projects, but the important thing is that I decided to stick to my commitment of making at least one video for each month, and that is what I'm going to do today. I read 3 books in April, which I'm going to talk about in just a second after I tell you about my new background. I actually created this myself with some floating bookshelves, a really cool laser level, and my power tools. And I did my best to arrange most of my TBR by color behind me. You can't see the shelves that are all the way up at the top, but I really love the way that this turned out, and I'm really excited to hear your thoughts about it. Do you like the new background? Do you prefer the hedge background that I created that was in my last video? I'm probably still going to end up switching back and forth just to try to keep things interesting, but I would like to hear your preference on which one you would like to see more. The 3 books that I read in April in order were A History of Wild Places by Shea Ernshaw, The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez, and A Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. Honestly, all 3 of these are going to be pretty interesting to talk about, but I will tell you that one of the things that I'm changing up with these videos is the way that I do the description of what the book is about. One of the things I appreciate about other booktubers is when they kind of just go with whatever comes to the top of their head when they're describing a particular story. And with me, I always try to think about what I want to say beforehand, and then I end up having all of these edits in between, which is fine, and it does end up sounding very clean, but I also felt like perhaps it sounded a little scripted. So this is going to be something new for me. I'm going to try my best to just talk about the book freeform, and we'll see how that goes. In A History of Wild Places, this book at least starts out from the perspective of a man named Travis Wren, who is sometimes hired as a kind of private investigator to find missing people. And the reason that he's hired is because he has a special ability that other people don't have, where he can hold an object that belonged to the missing person, and he can use that object in order to find where they currently are. When he goes on his investigation to try to find a young woman named Maggie St. James, the only information that he has is one word, and that word is pastoral. Based off of some research that he does, he realizes that pastoral used to be a community that was kind of a commune out in the middle of the woods, and nobody really knows anymore where it's located, so he sets out to try to find it. After the first chapter, we skip to other perspectives. There's 3 main perspectives in the book: a man named Theo, his wife Kala, and Kala's sister B. There's an element of added mystery that comes with this story, because not only does Maggie St. James go missing, but Travis Wren himself, during his investigation, also goes missing. So my boyfriend Keaton was actually the one who got me interested in reading this novel, because he bought this at a used bookstore, and when he sat down and started reading it, he read it in one day. We ended up going to a coffee shop together and getting lunch and hanging out at home, and the entire time he was very focused and dedicated to reading this story, to the point where I stayed up with him past midnight just so that he could get to the end. That was how captivated with this he really was. So I thought, if he ended up liking this book that much, then I need to bump that up to being the next thing that I'm going to read, which is why I read it as the first thing in April. And so I'm going to kind of get into my thoughts and feelings about this. Now, since this is a mystery thriller novel, I'm very limited on what I can tell you about the actual story, but I do have a couple notes on the writing style. So the first is that I think that this is a solid pick for a thriller novel, but I have some nitpicks. And the first is that Earnshaw will sometimes use language to describe things in a way that most people normally wouldn't, I think as a way of kind of trying to sound more intelligent. So a perfect example would be, for most of us, when we're talking about something that feels emotionally devastating, we might say something like, oh, I felt it in my chest, or it hit me in the heart, kind of thing. For Earnshaw, she specifically always described that feeling as hitting someone in the solar plexus. And I feel like that just sounds It sounds like somebody who went and looked up words in a thesaurus or was trying to sound more, I don't know, medically accurate, but that's just not the way that most people talk, and so I don't really like it when authors do that. The other nitpick that I have is I really don't like it when authors write as if they feel like the audience can't keep up with what they're saying. So there were instances in this story where the author would state one thing, and then like in the very next chapter from someone else's perspective, she felt the need to say it again. I got it the first time. I don't need you to say it multiple times. Outside of those nitpicks, I honestly feel like this was a really well-written story, so I wouldn't by any means dissuade people from reading it, but I do have another comment. As a general warning to fans of mystery and thrillers, Keaton does not typically read this kind of novel. So for him, the twists and the turns were something that were more novel. Now, I also don't read a whole lot of mysteries and thrillers, but I've read enough of them that when I was reading this story, I actually guessed every single plot twist. Some of them from the very beginning of the story, and Keaton actually got kind of irritated with me a couple times when I would like say, hey, like I think that this is what was going on, and of course he would respond like, well, I can't tell you, but I was right. So if you kind of know the beats of a mystery or a thriller, you know what to look for. And so this may end up being a story that pleases you and surprises you and delights you in some way. But for me, I'm not going to say that it fell flat, but I wasn't shocked by anything, really. Overall, though, I would still give this book a pretty solid 3.5 to 4 stars. I know that's kind of wishy-washy. Normally I give a very specific rating, but am I rating it based off of how I like the writing, or am I rating it based off of was it actually thrilling to read? It's a well-written story. Take for that what you will. Now, The Vanished Birds was my favorite book that I read this month, and also the only one that I picked from a very unique way. I went on Etsy, which is one of my favorite things in the world. I love Etsy. And I bought this, if I could hold it right side up, that would be great, a TBR tarot cards deck. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to overcome my TBR overwhelm, as it says. And I went and I shuffled the cards, which are very cute, by the way. This is the back of them. And the very first one that I chose was Choose a Book, which has a dedication to Mum. And this is from the UK, so some of them have like more British language on them, but it's really cool. So I started going through my books, and the very first one that had a dedication to Mum was The Vanished Birds. And the dedication specifically says, because I thought that this was really cute, "For Mom and Dad, the strangest people I've ever loved." Beautiful. This story is about a captain of a cargo vessel named Naya who uses what is called the pocket of space to travel great distances carrying cargo from one planet to another. The problem is that when she's in the pocket, she experiences time dilation, where 8 months for her is equal to 15 years for everyone else. So all of the people that she's ever really known and loved and cared about are all dead in the time that it takes her just to do her full job. But one day her life changes when a young mute boy ends up crashing on the planet where she picks up her cargo from, and she is then tasked with taking care of him until he exhibits some kind of mysterious power, and that ends up taking her on the journey of a lifetime. I personally feel like this novel is more dense than reading something like A History of Wild Places, even though the pages are comparable. And I think it's also just because, one, there aren't as many empty pages, but also the text in general is smaller than that hardback book. I knew going into this that it was going to be a sci-fi novel. That's one of the reasons why I picked it, is because I love science fiction. It never gets overly technical in its descriptions. Like, I honestly believe that this is a very accessible novel for anyone to read because it's not too high concept to understand. This book also finally made me realize something about my tastes in stories, and this goes for books and for movies. One of the things that I really love is good political intrigue. but specifically political intrigue that deals with corporations rather than government bodies. And the reason for that is because, at least in theory, a government is supposed to help its people. Its purpose is supposed to be there to make sure that it does whatever it can for the betterment of citizens of a particular place, right? With a corporation, their only goal is to make money. And that greed drives a lot of really interesting decisions and sometimes really horrible decisions. But it's kind of like Weyland Yutani with the Alien movies. I really love those movies to death, and there is a corporation in here that felt very, very similar. So if you like that kind of story, I definitely would say that it's really great. I also do want to give a warning about this book though, because the description on the back makes it sound like it's kind of a found family novel, which is something I also really enjoy. I'm obviously a huge fan of Becky Chambers, and she wrote the Wayfarer series. That's something that she handles extremely well. So I thought that this book was going to be more like that, and it kind of is about the first 75% of the way through, where there's still deep emotions, like complicated emotions that are present in this story, but I would still say overall it feels a little bit more lighthearted. The last 25% of this book straight up turns into a horror novel, like something that I think that horror writers could learn something from. Like, that's how good of horror it was, that it made me, a horror fan, deeply uncomfortable trying to read this, and just honestly sad. It made me so sad, but if you go into this knowing that, I don't think that it will be a problem for you. If you really want a comforting, like fun family novel that's also sci-fi, just go read Becky Chambers. Don't read this. I'm honestly not kidding when I say that I could tell that this story was special from the first couple pages. The prose are incredible. Jimenez really knows how to set a scene and how to kind of grip the reader. At least for me personally, I thought so. The one thing though is, if you're a chapter reader, like you like to just kind of bust out a chapter here and there, like shorter chapters in order to get through a book, a lot of his chapters are longer, you know, like 30 plus pages, 30 pages give or take in general. And so it might not be one of those books that you feel like you can kind of sit and sprint read or chunk read, depending on how you do it. But I didn't have any issues reading this story, and I honestly felt it was the best for me to read about like 75 to 80 pages in a day for me to get like the full effect from the story, just because of how long the chapters were. I would definitely give this 5 stars. I would highly recommend that you read it if you're a fan of sci-fi and possibly a little bit of horror. It was incredible and one of my favorite reads so far this year. And finally, I have Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. I also want to give a spoiler alert warning for Station 11, so if you haven't read that book and you want to, I would just recommend skipping this review altogether. This story takes place over 4 main time periods, so there's the early 1900s, 2020, the 2100s, and then the 2400s, and it does skip around between several different characters and perspectives, but the main character, you could say, is a far future investigator named Gaspery Roberts. Now what Roberts is investigating is he is jumping through time to try to learn about an anomaly that is occurring out in the forest of Vancouver Island, where whenever anybody walks under one specific maple tree, they hear and see things that aren't really there and seem to coincide with other parts in history. So they're trying to figure out how that is possible. My main review of this book is going to be more theory-based than a review of the actual writing style, but I will tell you that the writing is great, and I recommend that you read this book. So we'll go into it starting with that. This is a very well written story. For starters, there is a character named Olive who is an author, and she is set in the 2100s, and she is the author of a very popular book called Marianne Bad. I personally believe that Olive is a self-insert character of Emily St. John Mandel herself, and that Marianne Bad is a version of Station 11. So Olive wrote a book that's main plot features a pandemic where there is a prophet that is integral to the plot, and her novel was also published right before another pandemic happens. Now you might say, okay, that is kind of a coincidence, or yes, maybe she was writing from her perspective, but surely Marianne Bad isn't actually, Station 11 with just a different title. What confirmed it for me that they were the same book is this. While she was on her book tour, there was a person out in the audience who was asking Olive a question about her novel, and the question was this. I wanted to ask Olive about the death of the prophet in Marianne Bad. It could have been a much bigger moment, but you decided to make it a relatively small, not climactic event. I personally believe that this was a criticism that Mandel actually received with the death of the prophet in Station 11, because that was something that I personally felt also after reading the story, because I was going through and we're told that the prophet is the big bad of the story, and that's something I actually talk about in that other video that I linked somewhere on here. Truthfully, the story isn't even really about the prophet. The prophet is just kind of a way of moving the narrative along. So when he ends up dying, it feels like it just kind of happened and it was over, and that it wasn't really a big deal, even though it felt like it was supposed to be. And at the time I didn't really understand why, but now I believe I do. And what it really came down to is Mandel was showing, in a world where all of these people were dying and death happened all the time, the death of one more person didn't really matter. To the people who were dealing with the prophet and who were being chased by the prophet, his death mattered to them, because with him dead, it meant that they were safe. But in the grand scheme of things, in the grand scheme of life, his death didn't really matter at all. And because that comment was made to Olive about Marianne Bad while she was on her book tour, I honestly believe that Mandel probably had people coming up to her on a book tour about Station 11 who were saying things to her like the comments that Olive was getting, because there's just something about particular people who are fans of a story or who read a story that they somehow can feel entitled to impart their opinion to the author's face and just tell them like, hey, I don't understand why you did this, or I feel like you should have done this differently. I think that that's very narcissistic to like look at somebody and their creative work and a book that they published and go, well, I didn't like what you did, you should have done it better, or you could have done it differently. Yeah, they could have, but they didn't, and what's in the book is what got published, and if you don't like it, then you probably shouldn't be going to a book signing to talk to the author. That's my opinion. I just recognize that people can sometimes be very cruel, and if Mandel did receive comments like that while she was giving her book tour about Station 11, I personally feel very bad for her, because I don't think anybody should be treated that way. In my video about reading Station 11, I mentioned how wild it must have been for Mandel to write a story about a pandemic and have it published right before an actual pandemic happens. So guess which virus shows up in this book published in 2022? COVID is canon in this universe. On a completely non-pandemic related note, I really enjoy the way that time travel is handled in this story and how it relates to the simulation theory. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the simulation theory, it is the belief that we and our lives are actually currently living in a simulation by some other higher race, and that we aren't real and we're just in some giant computer somewhere. Gaspery Roberts is traveling back in time to learn about this anomaly to see if he can prove whether or not the simulation theory is real. The framing of the danger of time travel in this story is also very interesting, because it stems less from a fear of changing a timeline just because you're not supposed to change history, and more so because you have to be very careful not to change the timeline of the Time Institute. And the Time Institute is the only government-sanctioned body that is allowed to use time travel. So anyone else who tries to use time travel, they get locked in prison for the rest of their lives. But if you are somebody that does go back in time and you mess with the Time Institute, they basically will make you disappear. So another perfect example of a corporation or something along those lines that has ultimate authority and can do some really heinous things. So that, I love that. I thought that that was really interesting. That might make it sound like the Time Institute is the big bad in this story, and you could, I guess, make the argument that that's true. But I personally don't really feel like the Time Institute feels like a threat in the story so much as just like a looming presence. I would say that the grandness of this story stems less from the conflict that is present and more from the interconnected way that people's lives are tied together throughout history. And Gaspery, even though he's the main character, I wouldn't even honestly categorize him as our hero. He's the hero to a couple people, in this book, but in the grand scheme of history and in life, he isn't particularly important. His actions, like the death of the prophet, feel very understated and minor, and yet in their own way they do feel very important. This book is a perfect example of showing how life is this crazy amalgamation of all the small decisions that people make every day, and how something that might feel substantial to one person could be easily brushed off by another. It's a reminder that drama and climax are more from the perspective of the reader than the author. With that said, I wanted so badly for this book to be longer. It's only 255 pages, so when I was reading it, I was seeing the ending rapidly approach and going, I don't have enough time to learn all of the things that I want to know about. There was a mystery that was presented in this story about a woman named Vincent that goes missing off the side of the ship, and it really wasn't touched on or explored in any great way. So when the ending got there and I didn't get any sort of resolution, I was kind of miffed until I realized something. Mandel had another book that was released before Sea of Tranquility called The Glass Hotel, and it's about, you guessed it, Vincent. The fact that all three of the novels that I read from her were interconnected when I thought that each one was a standalone novel absolutely blew my mind, and I immediately had to go to the library and check this out as soon as I could. I rarely ever read books from the same author or in the same universe back to back because I get kind of burnt out on an author's particular writing style, even if it's something that I really enjoy, which is why I sometimes take large breaks in between series. But I feel comfortable reading this story immediately after Sea of Tranquility because each one of her books has been so different so far, and I recognize I've only read 2 of them. Okay, so I'm saying each of her books. I've only read 2. But I feel like this story is going to feel very different than either Sea of Tranquility or Station 11, so I'm very comfortable giving this a read immediately after. So I'm really excited for it. I'm gonna let you know what I think in great detail, I'm sure. Hopefully, maybe I'll even have some more theories from this book if this is interconnected at all to Station 11 or the Sea of Tranquility. We'll give it a shot. Overall, with regards to Sea of Tranquility, I gave this book 4.5 stars, and I would highly recommend giving it a read. And that's all that I have for you today. So thank you very much, my friends, for hanging out with me until now. And as always, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day or evening, that you all stay safe out there, and I'll see you next time.